So the question was, were most of the hippocampal neurons you were describing to us in right hippocampus, or were some in there?
Both. Both. The only
Did you see any difference?
No. The only lateralization effect we found, which is very strong, is a Nature Neuroscience paper from 3 or 4 years ago. Animals, we do have neurons firing to animals. So if you talk about category cells, neuron that fires to all members of a category, we have 2 categories that trigger responses. One is animals and the other is places. Animals, for some reason that I'm not sure I understand, they tend to trigger responses in the right amygdala, not in the left one.
Hippocampus I was talking about.
No, amygdala.
Yeah.
And the other thing, places tend to, that's a paper by Florian, that is coming out, actually the right amygdala is also by Florian. It's coming out in PNAS, places that tend to be in the parahippocampal cortex, which fits with the fMRI data. Okay, now, I forgot to say 2 or 3 things before we move to the weird part of my talk. I forgot to tell you something interesting about this. I was rushing and I forgot to tell you some of the key punchlines. It has to do a lot with what Jadine was saying before. It's very interesting, actually, with the critic from Haim also. In this case, the subjects were doing absolutely no task. I mean, it was completely taskless. I mean, the guys were just watching pictures. And then you see that there's an encoding as associations. And later, we ask them, hey, how much you link these to each other, these things to each other? And then we see that the neuron follow the personal associations by the subject, which is kind of like based on his or her personal experiences and so on. So there's no task in this. In the previous paper, the stuff that did Matthias, well, there was a task. They were forming this association. They had to remember that. But in this case, there's no task, right? They're doing nothing. And these neurons are encoding these things because we already have these responses from the first trial. So I will assume that the neuron was encoding Jennifer Aniston before I ran the experiment, right? It's not that something starts building up. So in other words, this speaks for a long-term coding of associations. The associations that these neurons are encoding, with what Emanuela showed, is not related to a task, and then this may decay and consolidate in cortex. No, the hippocampus has also a meaningful encoding of associations, which is not dependent on a task. So, Jadine, you were missing the discussion that I want to do about episodic versus semantic memory. The only point I was making is that since there was no task in this experiment, you cannot attribute this as some learning that is going on. The neurons are already encoding this. So this means there's a meaningful encoding, long-term encoding of associations, which has to do with memory, in the hippocampus. And this, you can take it, if you want to challenge the standard consolidation model, that hippocampal memories will consolidate into cortex. Well, no, there's a meaningful encoding without any task at all. I see I'm getting very controversial too early. Gosh, I will never end. Yeah.
Yeah, but so you did have a version of your experiment with a task, right? But
that's different patients. I mean, like, it's a different story.
Yeah, but still, would you find more concept cells in those patients than...
Yeah, so no. The number of concept cells is the same. The number of associations I create is 40% if I get them doing the task. If they don't do the task, it goes up to 4%. But it's still meaningful. Yes, Shadi?
Okay, but so in absolute numbers of concept cells,
no, the number of concept cells is the same.
It's the same. Okay.
Actually, they come after the screening sessions. So we use these neurons.
Although I missed the first sentence, and I apologize. I think, and if you mentioned it, then please tell me. But I think we should make sure that we are distinguishing between permissive, obligatory, and correlative. And forget about the correlative for now. But in these kind of studies, if you find evidence for, let's say, semantic-like memory in the hippocampus after a very long time, and this is an assumption that I understand.
I will not call it semantic, but
okay.
We can discuss it later.
Some products, which is not due to episodic encoding that occurred recently, okay? But it's not episodic in terms of retrieval. Correct me when I become wrong, okay? It's fine, because the models of hippocampal involvement in memory that I understand and there are some of them that some are not understandable, claim that the hippocampus may play a role in any type of memory after a very long time. It's just that it's obligatory for some kind of memory, not from others. So for example, if you provide semantic tasks,
Yeah.
you may find it into a normal individual, which are very long-term semantic tasks, very more. You may still find the hippocampus activated, specifically in the task, and then you would say, because there is some association that invokes or incites hippocampal activity. So these kind of studies do not show that the hippocampus is necessary. It just shows the hippocampus is there.
No, the only way I can interpret is there are two theories, and I don't agree with any of them. I think the truth is in between, but we can discuss it. That's a big discussion. Some people say the standard consolidation models, memories are formed in the hippocampus, and then every memory declarative will consolidate in cortex. And other people follow the memory trace theory, and they will say, yeah, memories are formed in the hippocampus, semantic memory will consolidate in cortex, and there's always an aspect of episodic memories that remains in the hippocampus. And if you take off the hippocampus, episodic memories are gone. And now, on top of this theory, you say, well, look how interesting, because here we don't have a task, so there are meaningful associations which are episodic-like, and I will tell you in a second why, because they are very personal, and they are not related to a task. It's a long-term coding. Now, yeah, but...
First of all, those are not theories, those are models.
Models, yes.
No theory.
Sorry, okay, models.
Second, there are very few theories in biology that they know, and you can know about it. And second, again, I think the issue is whether the models that you describe, like I put aside the standard consolidation model.
Yeah.
I think few people now trust that the standard consolidation model is really holding up.
Yeah, I agree.
And take the other models, they talk about the obligation of the hippocampus to be involved in the task, not about the fact that the hippocampus is involved in the task.
Yeah.
There is a difference between them.
I cannot talk about that. I mean, the only thing is that if you see the patient studies that Moscovich et al. Describe, I will say this fits nicely with what these guys are finding, because if you scoop out the hippocampus, or if there's some lesion in the hippocampus and the episodic memories are gone, and then I say, well, look, this is interesting, because we have a long-term encoding of subjective associations in the hippocampus, which is irrespective of the task. And it's not semantic, because these neurons are not encoding semantic associations. They are encoding specific associations. So, for example, if I have a neuron firing to Brad Pitt and the Taj Mahal, and I compare it with the association score between other similar actors and other similar places, it's way lower than the one that that encodes for the subject. So it's very personal.
They have hippocampus.
Eh?
They have hippocampus.
Hippocampus, yes.
Okay, but if you take out the hippocampus, you don't know what will happen to these memories.
No. No. Well, what people tend to argue is that it's exactly what you say. I mean, memories tend to be semanticized, and what remains is semantic memories. And there's not just a lack of episodic memory, there's also a lack of imagination and prospective planning, which I think depends on the ability of creating associations quickly and have these arbitrary associations. Yes.
So would you agree with the following? That probably these forms of what I call semantic associations are set up in neocortex, and therefore it's inevitable that they're reflected in hippocampus. But the reason that they get into hippocampus is so that you can associate that semantic representation with something else.
No.
Like a place.
No, you have semantic dementia. So you can have a person, you say, what is this? And the person will say, I have no clue. What is this for? I have no clue. And then I go like this and I say, what is this? I don't know, but it's exactly what you showed me before. There's no semantics, but there's still episodic memory. And the other way around. I mean, I can show a patient with episodic memory amnesia. I say, what is this? Yeah, it's a laser pointer. Use it to point. And then I say, what is this? Oh, it's a laser pointer. Have you seen it? Have you shown it before? No, I haven't seen it before.
I think we need to talk about that, because I don't agree with that.
That's not my paper. This is Kim Grafton of the well, you're from Oxford. These are the Cambridge people. Talking about semantic dementia.
Some more general discussion.
Well, you want to hear about Borges a little bit, because that's, That's what. Oh, first, I promised this neuron to somebody. Will the neuron fire to the boys, to whatever? I don't need to do the experiment because I have a neuron like that. This is not, that's not my best neuron, it's not my favorite one, but that's a neuron that fired to Yoda, to his name saved by the computer, which I don't know if you will hear. Let's try.
Yoda.
Can you hear that? So that was this response. The neuron is also fired to Luke Skywalker, not so much, I mean, it's a bit wobbly, it's not the best neuron, but
Luke Skywalker.
it's firing here, and also to the text Darth Vader, and I will show you this response, which is also very strong. That's this one. So whatever you do that triggers the concept, the neuron fires. That's why we stopped trying like the odor or the smell or the odor or the voice or so. Okay, now let me talk about this guy. And I will try to be, I'm doing it on purpose because I try to be controversial, hopefully to trigger a discussion. And Jorge Luis Borges was a writer from Argentina. For those of you who never heard of him, he was maybe the best writer in Spanish language in the 20th century. The best. The best. The best. Even better than Shakespeare. So, and Borges had a very interesting production. He only wrote short stories and some essays and prologues of some books and so on. But all what he wrote were short stories, like 10, 12 pages long, and that's it. So if you have never read Borges, he's amazing. I mean, you try it and you say, oh God, how come I never heard about this guy? And the thing he has is that you read the first lines and he drags you into the story like straight. I mean, you read the first 2 lines and you cannot stop. But it's very challenging because he's not an easy writer. He will challenge you around. I mean, you won't have an easy time reading Borges because he will make you think a lot. And he thought a lot about what he's writing. And in many of the stories, Borges likes to play with the idea of infinity. Like in the Aleph, in the Garden of the Forking Path, and in the story that I will tell you now called Funes de Memorius. And Funes de Memorius for Yadim and people that work on memory is kind of like a classic. I mean, many people have heard of this story working in memory. So it's the story of a peon, like a gaucho from the Pampas, that one day he falls from his horse, he knocks his head, and he wakes up with the amazing talent of remembering absolutely everything, right? So from then on, the guy will not forget a single thing. And I think it's very interesting because it opens a lot of interesting discussions. So Borges wrote this story in 1941, and he published it in 1942 in a newspaper called La Nación in Argentina. 7th of June, if I remember, 7th of June, 1942. Yes, I went to the National Library. They have all the newspapers since the early. Yes, yes. I even have like the previous pages. I mean, I took many pictures, and that's in the National Library. So you get these things. So I asked. I mean, I don't know where I got this data from. And I say, can I have the National Library? 7th of June, 1942. And then they give me a thing like this. And I go, and at some point, I mean, I open. Sorry?
Because you fell off the wall.
No, I wrote it down. No, I remember because I was desperate. I mean, I live in England, and when I went to Argentina, I went straight. And when I saw this page coming up, here, Funes de Memorius, Funes de Memorioso, that's the original. That's the first time this story was published. It starts here, it goes all the way here, and it ends here. It's a very short story. Now, let me tell you what he says. I won't tell you what he says. Let's hear what Borges says. I'm not good at reading, but he makes an amazing description of how will be the life of somebody with an infinite memory. And I think in a memory meeting, it's a very interesting starting point for discussions. So he said, we at a stroke perceive 3 cups lying on the table. Funes will see all the shoots and clusters and fruit comprised by a vine. He knew the shapes of the southern clouds at dawn on April 30, 1882, and could compare them in his memory with the streaks of a book of Spanish cover that he had seen only one, and with the swirls of the foam raised by an oar in the Rio Negro on the eve of the Battle of Quebracho. He then said, for example, Funes did not just remember every leaf and every branch of a tree, he will remember every time these leaves and branch look like when he saw the tree. He will remember every time he saw the tree, right? And the interesting twist of Borges was a writer, was not a scientist, right? An amazing writer, 1941. He says this. Funes talks to Borges in the story, and Funes says, I alone have more memories than all men may have ever had since the world exists. My memory, sir, is like a rubbish heap, un vaciadero de basuras, he said in Spanish, right? And then he's like, whoa, that's interesting. So the guy can remember everything, which looks cool. I mean, like, we all want to remember more. But then Borges, not a scientist, a writer, says that the guy recognizes himself, a fictional guy, that my memory is a rubbish heap, vaciadero de basuras. So it's not that good, maybe, to remember that much. Yeah?
This is really beautiful. There is a real case. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, it's coming.
Memories.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, no, I'm coming. First, I'm coming to this. Yeah, well, okay. So I was fascinated by this. And I was so fascinated that I tried to contact his widow, who's still alive, Maria Kodama. And I really wanted to know where this guy got this from, because it's brilliant. I mean, to realize that having way too much memory is counterproductive is not that obvious, especially for a writer, not for a scientist, no? And I start digging information, and the first thing is something that Borges mentions in his story, and it's an encyclopedia called Naturalis Historia, who was the first encyclopedia of humanity from the time of Christ. It was written by a guy called Pliny the Elder. And in this encyclopedia is described cases of extraordinary memory, like a guy called Charmadas the Greek, who could remember a book as if he was reading it. King Cyrus of Persia, that remembered the name of all the soldiers of his empire. On another one that could speak 22 languages of his kingdom, and so on. But of course, if you read an encyclopedia that has been written at the time of Christ, you can say, well, maybe it's an exaggeration, because I guess he won't remember 22,000 soldiers, no? Thousands and thousands of soldiers of the Persian Empire. And actually, if you go to different chapters, Pliny will describe, for example, people with extraordinary sight, and he will say that there was somebody that in the Punic Wars could see from a mountain in Sicily, he could see the ships taking off from Carthago, which is across the Mediterranean, and that's impossible. So basically, it's a lot of exaggeration. And I was wondering, did somebody like this existed, somebody like Funes? And of course, Jadin knows about this. And have you ever seen a photo of Shereshevsky? Yeah. Yeah, because it's in my book. I Googled, and there was one Russian guy in Trieste, actually, this one from Trieste, that he Googled and he used like Russian, he did a search in Russian and he found a picture. So that's how Shereshevsky looks like. And that was the closest it gets to Ireneo Funes. So you also saw him, no? Eh? Yeah. I have never seen this picture before. I Googled it and I couldn't find the picture. So that's the guy that could remember everything according to Luria. So this is a guy that one day came to Luria. Luria was like the grandfather of psychology in the 20th century in Russia, Soviet Union. And he came to Luria said, well, what's your problem? And then the guy says, I can't forget. And Luria said, well, what do you mean you can't forget? I just can't forget. And Luria, at the time that was in the 1920s, gave Shereshevsky a list of numbers to remember, 30 numbers. Shereshevsky will look at them and he will repeat them without a problem. 50 numbers, no problem. 70 numbers, no problem. So, and that's like one of the lists he used it. And he remembered every column, every row, no problem. The way Luria describes this in a beautiful book called The Mind of a Mnemonist, and if you study memory, you must read this book. It's really poetry, it's amazing. Very short also, but very beautiful. Luria said that the guy had kind of like the table imprinted in his head. It's like he had a photograph of the table somewhere in his brain and couldn't understand it. Now, it gets so crazy that Luria was so excited that he kept on seeing Shereshevsky for 30 years. And 15 years later, he asked Shereshevsky, do you remember the table I showed you the very first time you came to see me? And Shereshevsky said, yeah, of course. You were wearing your coat and this and that and a tie of this color, and the table was like, prah. And he just said the table from beginning to end. And Luria could compare because he took notes and he was comparing with his notes. And it was like that. So the interesting thing, for me, brilliancy of Luria was that at some point he said something very brutal. He said, in his book, he said something like, I failed in the easiest task you can ask a psychologist, which is to find the limits of somebody's memory. That's the easiest you can do as psychology. You just keep on giving a list longer and longer, and at some point your memory fails. And this guy said, I quit. I cannot find the limits of this guy's memory. But then the brilliancy is that he stopped bothering about that. He said, well, okay, it may have a limit or not, I don't care. The interesting thing is how is it to live with such memory? And then Luria turns more into the human side of Shereshevsky, how he feels to live with such memory. And then he realized Shereshevsky was not really having a great time with all these memories. For really, he was struggling, he was suffering with these memories. And then, you want to say something about Shereshevsky? Yeah.
Because the one amazing thing about him was that he was also an synesthetic.
That's a different story. So Shereshevsky had an amazing memory to start with, then he became a professional mnemonist. And he described, he wasn't like trying to do some magic things or no, he describes exactly how he did it. The way he did it is because he had a very strong synesthesia, and for him, numbers were things. Like 1 was a tall guy with mustache, 2 was a fat woman, I don't remember, the associations, but every time he has to remember a list of things, he was having these images. And a big chunk of our brain is visual. So the fact that he could always translate these things into visual images really helped him. The other bit is that he was using a very well-known method in mnemonics called the method of loci, which basically you place the items along a track that you know very well. For example, the street of your neighborhood, and then you say, if you have to remember a list of words, you imagine the words, you imagine the elements, and you put them along the track. And that comes from ancient Greece, from Simonides. But let's stop there, because I want to go into the other side of the coin. Now, look how clever Luria. One time, he gave him this table. It's obvious, no, it's trivial. We all remember that. And of course, Shereshevsky remembered the table, but he didn't realize they were consecutive numbers. He was using brute force. That's what Luria says in his book. Another time, with another big psychologist from Russia, called Vygotsky actually asked Shereshevsky to remember a list of items, and the list were many, many different things. I will make it up, I don't remember, but it will be like chair, shoe, trousers, water, coffee, poster, I don't know, wall, and so on, and so on, and so on. So Shereshevsky could repeat the list completely, backwards, from the middle, as you want. Now Vygotsky asked him, name me the liquids in this list. And if you remember, I think water and coffee. He couldn't. He couldn't. He could repeat the whole list, but he couldn't extract information from the list. Now, what Luria says, I think I'm quoting his words correctly, he says that Shereshevsky was quite inept at any logical organization. So he can remember at the low level, but he couldn't really abstract the information. And I skip that. And that's a very interesting, well, actually, I don't skip that. I was wondering, well, maybe Borges knew about Luria, because Luria studied Shereshevsky before, was in the 20s. But Luria published his book, this beautiful book, The Mind of a Mnemonist, in 1968 in English. And Borges was not a scientist. And I talked to many people that knew Borges and his widow, and he didn't read psychology. He didn't read Luria. He didn't read this type of things. He was interested in other stuff. So Borges didn't know the book. They came with these two things in parallel. So Borges with the fictitious character of Ireneo Funes, and Luria with the study of Shereshevsky. And they're quite common. Both of them have problems, with high-level thinking, and both of them can remember a lot. But there was something that Borges knew very well, and was this guy, William James. And he knew William James very well because William James was the brother of Henry James, who was a very famous American writer. William James is the grandfather of our side of psychology, Luria on the other side, no? And also the father of Borges was a lawyer, but he used to teach, and he was teaching psychology. So he was taking Borges to the National Library, the same where I found this newspaper. He was the director, Borges, later on, of the National Library. And Borges was reading books of William James. And I met his widow, and his widow allowed me to see his personal library, the library he had at home. And in his books, I found many books of James. And James, in this book called Principles of Psychology, and I think basically do an experiment just to prove one thing after the other. He was right in most of the things he said, but he said something very interesting. That was 1890, right? 1890. So he said, if we remember everything, we should be on most occasions be as ill off as if we remember nothing. Look at this. The paradoxical result is that one condition for remembering is that we should forget. Without totally forgetting a prodigious number of states of consciousness and momentarily forgetting a large number, we could not remember at all. To remember, we have to forget, right? So Borges was very familiar with these things. And closer to our times, there are a few guys called Savants, and there are other people that other people study. And that was a very famous one, Kim Peek, because on his story was based the movie Rain Man. I think I have a slide of, no. And this guy could recite a book out of memory, and he had like an amazing memory, but he has zero understanding of things. And the first person describing people like him was actually Lansdowne Down in the ends of the 19th century. Lansdowne Down is the same of the Down syndrome. The name comes from him, after him. And Lansdowne Down, in a big conference, I don't remember which one, he was describing 10 cases of what he called savants. He actually called them idiot savants at the time. And he was talking about a guy. Idiot was not pejorative at the time, that's why he used this term. But he wanted to say that the guys were like geniuses on the one hand, savants, but they were idiots. They had a serious problem on the other. And he was describing cases, like for example, he described one, Lansdowne Down, of a guy that can just tell you from beginning to end, out of memory, the rise and decadence of the Roman Empire. Rise and decadence of the Roman Empire is, I'm saying the title wrong. It's a book by Gibbon, it's a big book. But the guy didn't understand the book. The guy didn't know what the book was about. So he can really tell things out of memory, but he cannot really process the information to give you some interpretation of that. Yes?
How does that relate to creativity?
To?
Creativity.
Ooh.
If you're able to abstract,
Yeah.
you see connections between things that
You're
actually were connected.
You're taking me to a completely different path, but it's so beautiful that I cannot say no. That's very controversial, what I will say. I don't know if it's very controversial, but you can challenge it. For me, because first, what is creativity and intelligence and so on? We don't agree on what is creativity. For me, at least, let me put it more humbly. One aspect of creativity is to make associations that are not obvious. Between disparate things. For example, realizing that something falling down here and the moon not falling down responds to the same phenomenon, and it's gravity, right? Or realizing that what keeps me down to the earth and the force that I have in a rocket that is accelerating in outer space is also the same, and it has to do with relativity of these things. So, for me, a big component of creativity is to make associations between disparate things. Now, if you want to make associations, the first thing you have to do is you have to extract a meaning. And I will argue that the machinery for extracting the meaning, the main component for extracting meaning is forgetting details and making abstractions, right? So, and this is exactly what was lacking in these guys. So these guys could not really abstract the meaning and therefore could not make associations, could not tell a story. And if you read the book of Luria, Luria is telling similar things about Shereshevsky. So for example, one time he had a phone call with Eisenstein, who was the cinema director in Russia, the Potepkin. And then Luria asked him about the conversation with Eisenstein, and Shereshevsky said, I don't know, I can remember all the words and all the intonations of the word because he was so engaged in the way he talked. I remember exactly how he intonated, but what did he talk about? He couldn't tell. Okay, I think I skip all these things, but there are two things, and that goes on the area of Simon. There are two processes that we tend to see separated. One is perception, the other is memory. And actually, if you study the pathway of perception, which Simon did, very, very beautifully, you see that goes from B1 to 80 cortex with all the latencies, how long it takes from a signal to one to an area and the other, and then it goes straight into the memory areas. So there might be not that dissociated. It's all like a flow of information. And there's a principle that is the same, for me at least, that's my idea, I mean, it's not like textbook knowledge, in perception and memory. They're both based on abstractions of extracting meaning and making inferences. So in perception, that was back to Aristotle, but the one that described it very nicely was Helmholtz, also in the late 19th century. Basically, Helmholtz say that we don't see reality as it is, we see signs of reality, and we are based on unconscious inferences. We are always making inferences. We are constructing the reality, but what we actually see is very little, no more than that, right? The same principle was described by Bartlett in the early 20th century in Cambridge. So Bartlett was giving his student folk stories, and the students were reading the stories, and then they have to repeat them, and Bartlett realized the guys don't remember anything. And basically, they're just making it up. They believe they're remembering it, I mean, if they're repeating many times, but they're changing the story massively. And every subject will change the story depending on their own background, because they will try to make it fit to their own beliefs and so on. So Bartlett say that we don't remember as a continuum of memory as in a video, in a movie. We just create an schema, which is our interpretation of reality. And this schema is the skeleton of our memory. So Helmholtz talk about signs for perception, Bartlett talk about schema for memories. They're basically saying the same thing. The brain does abstractions from very little information, extracts meaning, and then construct a reality based on inferences.
So in that case, maybe the person remembered so much because he couldn't abstract and he couldn't forget, in a way.
Which person, Shereshevsky?
Yes.
Well, I mean, he was focused on details and focused. If you ask me, what does this second part of the talk has to do with the first part of the talk? I cannot go slide by slide. I have to get rid of all these details and so on. And basically, I will say, well, because now I'm talking about abstraction and so on, and the neurons I talked before, they're actually representing abstractions. And that's the link that is coming now. But if you ask me to do associations, to make some thinking, and if I'm not able to get rid of the details, I'm stuck. Yes?
What about the working memory? So, for example, Shereshevsky, would you say that his working memory was like that of a normal guy, or is it like is his memory?
I think it wasn't tested. I mean, it was tested. Was it? I mean, Luria never did a specific working memory experiment. I think.
Wasn't available at the
Yeah.
20s.
Yeah, exactly. It was 1920s. So
the concept came up in the 60s by Niederer.
yeah.
And before that, people didn't refer to that as working memory, so there were no tasks.
It's just interesting to think like how does he perceive that memory? Like as
Working memory.
Yes. No. This Shereshevsky, for example, is he remembering it like we look at something and he just reads out from what he sees?
He changed. He changed. If you read Luria's book, he tried many things because he was seriously trying to forget. He couldn't do it. So he will do many things. He will do something called I always forget this word.
Eidetic.
Exactly. So you will try, instead of remembering the whole thing, you will try to get like a tag of the thing. And you remember only the tag and not the whole thing. Well, with this the tag is much less than the whole thing. He tried that, this didn't help. He tried writing down things and putting it in a drawer. So basically I said, well, if I know that the things are in the drawer, I'll need to remember. He will still not forget. He was burning the notes, as if the physical burning of the notes will burn the memories. The only thing that ended up helping at the end of the day, was when he stopped caring about this, he's like, he stopped paying attention to it. And then he slowly, started to forget a bit more. Okay, let me make the link now. Otherwise, there will be two things that they have nothing to do. Oh, yes. So let me go back. I don't know how much time I will have to speculate, but let me go back because I gave you I took a lot of time to give you the basis for now being bold. And you can challenge, you can tell me that I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, but I will go for it. So I show you these neurons. So you have neurons in the hippocampus, which is a key memory area that they are representing concepts. They don't care about the details. They just represent Jennifer Aniston or Halle Berry, even if you write the name, or me in this case, or associations between concepts, and associations between concepts, right? So what are these neurons doing? So I call them the building blocks of memory. And they're representing concepts because a memory function is to create associations between concepts. Or I would say the skeleton of episodic memories is to create associations between concepts. Now, you may argue, well, that's not, there is to it. No, episodic memory is much more than that. Yeah, I remember when I was in Barcelona, I laid on the sea and this and that. And I said, well, but maybe if you think hard, you may not remember that much. Maybe you remember just a few things. And you will say, no, but I remember exactly how the sea looked like, and I remember surfing away or whatever. Okay, maybe you do have more detailed memories, but I will argue these memories are in cortex. And I don't know the mechanism of how the movement of skin today can be stored in my cortex. It will never be stored. I will be still a disaster. But there's an interplay between hippocampal and cortical memories. And I will argue that cortical memories, they are encoding a sketch representation which is based on few associations, which are the skeleton of an episodic memory. I met Simon in a particular place, and we talk about that, or whatever else you want to add to it. Now, how this may work? Well, imagine that you have a bunch of neurons in the hippocampal formation, and then you have an engram, an assembly, let's call it assembly, coding for Luke Skywalker. So a set of neurons, there's never one, no, I'm just looking at one out of many. So imagine that you have 1,000 neurons encoding for Luke Skywalker. And then you have another set of neurons encoding for Yoda. How do you make the association? Well, it's kind of like Donald Hebb stuff, no? Some neurons fire into one of the things, will start firing to the other and the other way around. So basically, you end up with these partial overlapping assemblies. So you will have some neurons that will fire to both concepts. And these neurons then make the link between the two concepts. So if you see Luke Skywalker, you will make also this neuron fire. And this, by pattern completion, this may decay with time. And by pattern completion, this will lead to the representation of Yoda. And that's the very famous flow of consciousness of Marcel Proust. You think of something, then you have a sketch representation which brings you to an associated thing, and so on. And there's another thing going on, is that these neurons, they are not alone. Remember that they are talking to cortex. So if you think of Yoda now, you may remember his voice, you may remember the features, you may remember many things which might be in different cortical areas, right? And these neurons are somehow pointing to these cortical areas. So you are bringing a full representation. So you have the sketch flow of consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, on top in the hippocampus, and these points down to cortex. Now, the question is, how much can I won't put you in this, can we, well, because if I'm wrong, I am wrong, not all of us, how much can I explain about memory with just this simple scheme? And that's a challenge. I don't think I can explain everything. I think there are many things that are impossible to explain with that. But if we think about all what we discussed before, maybe that can already explain a lot, because it's not really that much what we remember. We believe we remember a lot, but maybe what we actually do remember is a tiny fraction of what we think we remember. And this idea of flow of memory, like a continuum, this episodic memory, this time travel, is an illusion. It's an illusion or a construction based on very salient events, and then we fill in the gaps based on assumptions. Exactly the same of what Helmholtz said about perception. And I think with this, Borges. I finished with Borges. That's the book I meant. That's the book with the Shereshevsky picture. So I finished with Borges. So back to the story of Funes de Memorios, that's the key for me. And that what really got me crazy. Actually, if I'm honest, when I first found these neurons, these Jennifer Aniston neurons, I had no clue what they were doing. And one day it was like, pack, Funes de Memorios. And then I went back to Funes de Memorios, I reread Borges, and then I started thinking in the way I'm presenting in this talk. And then I said, that starts to make sense. But actually, it was not me, it was just remembering the story of Borges. Look what he said. Remember, now we have a neuron firing to Halle Berry, no matter how you show her, even if you write the name. So now, see what Borges says about Funes de Memorios. He said, do I have it in English? Yeah. It was not only difficult for him to understand that the generic term dog embraces so many unlike specimens of different sizes and different forms, he was disturbed by the fact that the dog at 313, seen in profile, should have the same name as the dog at 315, seen from the front. That's a complete lack of abstraction, of invariance. And this is the key. That's the greatest. To think is to forget differences, to generalize, to abstract. In fullness crowded world, there was nothing but almost immediate details. And I think I skipped the language thing. We can discuss it over dinner. So I stop there. Thank you.